CNN and organizations like it do not have your best interests at heart. And those who are shouting boycott CNN should actually look at their own actions before making any resolute statements. So, for those of you who have not been following the news recently, CNN had done a sea shift in terms of how it is going to present its information. As opposed to being a 24/7 propaganda mouthpiece for leftist center ideals, CNN's new leader, Chris Licht, has said that it wants CNN to be more Republican-friendly, meaning it wants it to move more towards the center, and the fears of some leftists have interpreted this as CNN taking a hard rightward shift. Indeed, this is why the term boycott, #boycottcnn, has trended periodically over the past few weeks, ever since Brian Stelter was fired and Chris Licht announced this new sort of centerward, rightward direction. And many Twitter users have even said that if they wanted to go ahead and see MAGA rhetoric, they would go to a different network, which signifies that CNN giving ground to any conservative or right-of-leaning opinion in the minds of some people is synonymous with actually endorsing said opinion. Isn't it interesting how concepts work in the minds of, indeed, some people? And so the Hill Reporter wrote an article on this, which has been cited significantly, in which they cited different instances of CNN personalities using right-wing rhetoric. For example, when Don Lemon asked a question about Joe Biden's mental state, which for many of us is a self-evident condition that any person who is concerned about the perpetuation of our country and the faculties of the man who governs the executive branch should be worried about. Him asking that question is allegedly evidence of Don Lemon becoming a MAGA supporter. Dana Bash, someone who I still have a personal grudge against because she engineered the narrative against Ron Paul in 2011, as did other CNN personalities, but that's a different point. She asked a question to a Republican congressman, and leftist Twitter users criticized her for not pushing back. There was no pushback. And so for these reasons and more, many people are, quote-unquote, boycotting CNN. And when I saw this, my friends, I immediately thought of two important concepts that I want to teach all of you before this video is up. And these two concepts, these two arguments are this. Number one, the fact that CNN does not care about you, it does not care about your values. By the way, neither do a lot of corporate media. That's the first concept I want to teach you guys. And number two, CNN is a functionary of a broader context in America, which is actually bringing down the level of discourse and discussion in our country and harming our ability to actually accomplish things in politics and understand the nature of correct and just politics. Let us get to proving these two claims. The first one. So, my friends, the response from leftists saying that we don't want a right-wing channel, we'll go over to MSNBC, signifies this belief that CNN somehow at some point in time represented their values. And this is not simply a belief amongst leftists. This is a belief amongst people of all political sides who believe that their favorite corporate media network represents what they truly believe, ergo, their network serves as an agent, as a functionary of their worldview. And for many reasons, this kind of practice has been decried and derided, but not for the proper reason. And the proper reason is this. No corporate media, especially not CNN, actually cares about your values. CNN is an organization regulated by internal self-interest. Whatever perpetuates CNN's influence over the airwaves is what their executives and their producers and their anchors from the top to the bottom will adhere to. If something does not perpetuate CNN's ascent over and control over the airwaves, then its executives will not okay it, and they will re-coordinate and order their actions in the direction that will perpetuate their rise. CNN has been doing absolutely horrible ever since Donald Trump is no longer president anymore, ever since Donald Trump was out of the White House. And The reason for this is that CNN's entire coverage for the Trump years was focused on Donald Trump. This was a big story that was, the lid was blown on it. They were essentially laser focusing on him to the exclusion of every other thing. That was because CNN has a self-interest, not because CNN actually believes in the values of people who are anti-Trump. This must be understood, my friends. Corporate media is a business. Corporate media does not exist to actually engage in intellectual conversation and understand the truth of reality. Corporate media exists to perpetuate the context that it's in. And if that context prides viewerships over morals and values, then viewership will be what is pursued by that entity. CNN is pursuing viewership right now. Some may say, well, we hope CNN becomes a better network. No, the very model of CNN is rotten to the core because, again, there is no pursuit of higher ideals. It is simply trying to stay amongst the swamp, stay amongst the decaying water, and not rise out of the decaying water and go along the main course of the river. If you see CNN, or if you see the media landscape as a river, if you imagine an analogy of a river, independent media is going along the river neatly, whereas corporate media have been sectioned off into separate lakes that are separated from the main course of the river, and those are called oxbow lakes, where nothing comes in or out, and people who are held captive in those lakes are the ones they're preaching to. But if you don't access the main course of the river, you're not actually going to be able to speak truth to anything, to actually contribute productively. That is the problem with most corporate news media today. They don't hold your values. They want to perpetuate their own existence. The sooner you understand this, the more irrational it seems to say, well, we'll just go over to MSNBC. MSNBC doesn't care at all either. They care about perpetuating their own existence. When people understand this, we can better interact for corporate media for what they are, and that is facilitators of certain narratives, certain worldviews, not dispensers of truth, as they are claimed to be. But there's also a second point that kind of ties into this point, but it's broader, and it's more about the state of American journalism in general. And it's that CNN and a lot of other corporate media are functionaries, as I mentioned before, claim to, of a broader context in which American political discourse remains shackled to the block of mediocrity. And this broader context is a system in which process usurps principle, and principle is not considered. What do I mean? There were two men, Flesch and Gunning, who helped engineer American journalism to the state to where it is right now. Now, before the 1940s, my friends, if you read a newspaper, it would be incredibly hard for you to understand unless you were a college graduate, a college-educated person. A lot of people in the country were not that. So what Flesch and Gunning did, they came into the journalism business and they essentially gave newspapers tips on how to communicate more effectively and widely to a broader audience. And this one principle that I'm about to share with you has defined 50, 60, 70 plus years of American journalism up to this point, and that is the Flesch maxim, which says, write as you talk. Write as you talk, which basically means avoid big language and simply speak plainly and use that method to convey information to your listeners. Now, there's nothing wrong with the Flesch maxim by itself, but there are several problems that immediately arise when trying to adopt this kind of rule. Number one, it is ambiguous and vague. What if I talk in a manner that is indicative of a college professor? Well, that would go against the spirit of the Flesch maxim, which basically says that we want to be more accessible to people. And specialized knowledge is by definition inaccessible to most people and only accessible to some people. So that's one thing. It's vague. It suffers from its own problem. It's a vague term. Number two, what it means to speak in an accessible way has changed over the course of several generations. What it meant to be non-college educated in 1940 or 1930 is definitely not what it means to be non-college educated in 2022. My friends, the standard of speech and communication has degraded over time to the extent that now, these days, if you say a word that someone is at least the least a bit familiar with, and you're trying to communicate them through a medium such as this, they might very well turn you off or accuse you of being condescending because they don't understand the big word you just used. And this is the problem, because we have a society right now which is attuned to not understanding or not wanting to engage with concepts in a deep way, but wanting to get things fed to them in a simple way. This does not mean that the people who want this aren't intelligent. Many of them are, in fact, quite intelligent, but it means they're comfortable. And human beings, being these comfortable creatures, don't always like to be risen out of our comfort. This is one of the reasons why there are some people who have more conservative tendencies and there are other people who don't have more conservative tendencies. But throughout history, you've seen this idea where we like to be comfortable, we like to stay in our spot. And there's nothing inherently wrong with this. But when this translates over to how you see knowledge and how you see the world, and you're comfortable having a fixed idea of what the world is and what knowledge is and not actually challenging yourself, reevaluating yourself, then you're no longer a thinker, you're a dogmatist. You need to be a thinker to be a complete and full human being. You need to be a thinker to understand what the media is telling you. If you don't understand what the media is telling you, then they don't have a function that is useful to you or your development as a individual in any particular context. The problem with the flesh maxim is that it doesn't account for a society that doesn't value thinking. We have a society right now that values 60-second TikTok videos over even a measly 15-minute lecture on a complicated topic because it's easy. And this is not me being I'm not trying to condemn anybody, because I myself have fallen and still do fall prey to the same allure of that quick and easy instant gratification that social media has fed me. But my friends, we have to resist, and in an era in which instant gratification and not knowledge is being pursued, the flesh maxim, talk as you, or rather write as you speak, is not going to be able to account for that problem. The problem is the flesh maxim is simply the medium, the vessel for getting information to people. But it doesn't consider what principle in society are people consuming information under. That means, how do people in that society view information? Is information a commodity, or is something to be chased to understand the nature of life, to understand the nature of the universe, to understand what truth is? And the media treats it as a commodity, and so they're not interested in the truth per se. They're interested in doing whatever they can do to keep you clicking or watching their content. Ergo, they're not going to actually pursue the higher value of truth. They're going to use the flesh maxim. They're going to use process to override principle because it benefits them. It is a utilitarian calculus which is destroying our culture's ability to grapple with certain very philosophically intricate concepts. For example, democracy dies in darkness is a direct consequence of the flesh maxim because it is an idea that is not challenged, i.e. it does not follow the principle of knowledge, and it is stated very plainly in a visceral way that most people can actually understand it. No one who uses that term actually considers, what is democracy? Are you presupposing that America is a democracy? Because that's not the truth. How can an idea die? None of these things are actually asked or questioned, and there are just so many different examples of this in the journalistic world. He will not divide us. We see commentators on cable news saying that all the time about Donald Trump, but they're not asking the question, who's divided? Are the Trump supporters who support him divided? Because they seem pretty united to me in their support. Here's the problem. In our culture right now, talking points are more valued than deep and intimate relationship with knowledge, a deep and intimate relationship with the nature of things, a deep and intimate relationship with how things are, not how we aspire them to be. And in that matrix of how we aspire things to be, media outlets like CNN are there to prop up and project that matrix and not get you to think. This is the problem with the flesh maxim. It's ambiguous and it does not account for a society in which knowledge, real knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, is not held as a value. And in a society where knowledge is not held as a value, writing as you speak is writing in a way that also does not reflect deep thinking. And aren't you watching the news to get information? Aren't you watching the news to understand what's happening in the world? How can you understand what's happening in the world if you don't even understand, watch this, if you don't even understand how to interpret what's happening in the world? This is the affliction of most people trapped in the corporate media sphere. And this is why that boycott CNN hashtag was misguided. Not because CNN is great, they're not, they're horrible. They have been at the center of so many lies. They omitted the Hunter Biden story. There are so many things about CNN that poses it as an enemy of truth. But it's not just CNN. It's the context that CNN exists in, the media context. And the media context exists in the broader societal context of a society which does not value knowledge, which instead values instant gratification. And in a society that does not value knowledge, it cannot interpret knowledge, and that society ends up seeking what I call imitation concepts. Ideas that seem plausible, but are a matter of fact specious, empty, and hollow. And we don't have a defense mechanism against those ideas because the societal norm is to just whisk ourselves away with those ideas, not question them, not confront them. And if we do question and do confront them, many of us do them in superficial ways. You can't understand ideas without first understanding philosophy. That does not mean you need to have a degree, but it does mean you need to be willing to think. If you think deeply about a particular issue, you're a philosopher. They don't want you to think. They want you to speak or write as you talk without actually considering that. When I mean they, I mean the media outlets that are feeding you stuff, that are feeding you information that is not well considered, that are feeding you phrases like democracy dies in darkness, that are feeding you phrases like he will not divide us, that are feeding you phrases like insurrection and things of that sort. Media outlets that do this ad nauseum without actually justifying their positions don't do so because the point is not to justify their positions. The point is to assert until these ideas are running a feedback loop in your mind and you are hooked. That's why this boycott CNN stuff is misguided, because it misses the broader point. The enemy of knowledge is society's current attitude towards knowledge. And to beat that, you have to stop watching CNN and corporate media in general, watch more independent creators, and first and foremost, consider things for yourself. Don't rush to your favorite news outlet or even your favorite content creator, whether it be me or someone else, and say, well, if they think this or if they say this, I like it because I agree with it or whatever. No. Question, challenge everything within limits. Don't be an iconoclast for no reason, within limits. And in that questioning and challenging, the world will become so much simpler to understand. It'll make so much more sense. And in a world that makes more sense, it's a world where we can actually understand what we're being given by the media and not become sponges, soaking up every bit of nonsense until it clogs up our ability to be free-thinking individuals and human beings. My friends, think on what I've said. I love you guys so much. Please be sure to follow this channel, like this channel, subscribe to this channel, comment on this video. If you want to donate to me, all the information will be in the comment section down below. I love you guys so much, and please stay offensive. Bye, guys.